Have you ever felt the tug of war between wanting structure and craving independence? That quiet tension doesn't just exist inside you. It has shaped entire societies. Imagine living in a world where there are no rules, no leaders, and no protection. What happens? Do people come together peacefully, or do they fall into fear and chaos? For centuries, brilliant minds have sought to determine how much security we can accept without sacrificing our freedom. Let's examine how they navigated the balance between control and freedom, providing us with insights that still resonate in our lives today. Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. Before we begin, just a quick housekeeping note. If you enjoy what I'm doing, a like and subscribe would be really helpful. It goes a long way in keeping the channel going. And don't forget to drop a comment. I'd really love to know what you think. Thomas Hobbes was the first to present this problem with its most renowned solution. For him, fear was not merely an emotion, but the very basis of political life, a force powerful enough to shape the kind of state that could unite society. He grew up in 17th century England, a nation troubled by division and civil war. Born in 1588, Hobbes lost his father early and was brought up by relatives, only to see his homeland tear itself apart through decades of violent conflict. For Hobbes, this wasn't just theory. He observed communities broken, rulers overthrown, and neighbors turned against each other. From that experience, he reached a stark conclusion. Once order breaks down, nothing else, freedom, prosperity, even basic trust, can survive. That vision led him to describe life without authority as nasty, brutish, and short. This was not merely a flourish, but his summary of what occurs when human beings, driven by fear and self-interest, lack a common power to restrain them. Outside of government, he argued, people live in what he called the state of nature, a war of all against all. In that state, no agreement endures. No family is secure, and no project can survive long enough to bear fruit. Hobbes believed there was only one way out, a sovereign power so strong that no one could challenge it. In 1651, he expressed this idea in his renowned book, Leviathan. The Leviathan could be a monarch or an assembly, but what mattered was its absolute authority. Individuals, he argued, had to relinquish most of their rights to this authority in exchange for protection. Through this social contract, people surrendered their capacity to enforce their own will, enabling the sovereign to establish peace throughout the entire society. Power, in this sense, was concentrated at the top to shield everyone from chaos. Unlike earlier defenses of monarchy, Hobbes's justification for obedience did not rely on divine right or noble duty. It was based entirely on fear of violence, fear of disorder, fear of death. In his reasoning, fear was not a sign of weakness, but a rational guide, convincing people to accept authority to avoid destruction. He likened the sovereign to a dam that holds back a flood. Safe, yes, but at the expense of blocking the natural flow of liberty. For Hobbes, this exchange was rational and necessary. If one sought protection from violent death, one had to accept a power strong enough to enforce peace against every individual's will. The ruler did not need to embody virtue or claim to fulfill divine justice. Their sole obligation was to provide protection. If that was achieved, obedience was owed, because the alternative, life without order, was intolerable. Still, Hobbes was not blind to the fragility of loyalty. In Leviathan, he quietly admitted that obedience ended if the sovereign failed to keep people safe. If protection failed, the contract would dissolve. People could then shift their obedience to a new sovereign, whoever provided security. This subtle qualification made his theory even more controversial among monarchists. For a king who desired absolute loyalty, Hobbes's claim that loyalty could change sounded dangerous, almost subversive. The boldness of Hobbes's argument lay not only in its conclusion, but also in how it redefined political obligation. Safety, rather than morality or religion, became the primary principle of government. Freedom without safety was pointless because it could be taken away at any moment. Fear, rather than hope, unified society. That conviction made his work one of the most unsettling, yet also one of the most influential contributions to modern political thought. Hobbes's approach drew not only from the turmoil of his time, but also from history. He studied and translated the Greek historian Thucydides, whose suspicion of democracy and emphasis on political instability strongly influenced him. What Hobbes found in those texts reflected his own age. Where discipline faltered, destruction ensued. His lessons were reinforced by both the past and the present, convincing him that liberty without strong authority was an illusion. He acknowledged that sovereigns might sometimes be cruel or unjust, but for Hobbes, the alternative, anarchy, was even worse. Tyranny could deny comforts, but chaos threatened survival itself. His contract was not meant to protect individual rights in all situations, but to ensure that life could continue at a tolerable level. Agreements made in fear, he argued, were still binding because fear was the foundation on which society avoided collapse. Not everyone agreed. Many of his critics argued that Hobbes went too far. By granting the sovereign absolute power, he risked abuse without any system to prevent it. Once people had transferred their rights, nothing stopped the ruler from trampling them. A cure for anarchy threatened to become its own kind of sickness, unchecked tyranny. Hobbes argued that freedom was already lost without order, so the trade-off was necessary. However, many found his reduction of politics to mere safety to be dangerously narrow. The uproar surrounding Leviathan was intense. To devoted monarchists, Hobbes's suggestion that allegiance could shift undermined the very foundation of monarchy. To advocates of more participatory government, his Leviathan appeared to be a defense of dictatorship. Most explosively, to religious audiences, his stark materialism and perceived atheism was unacceptable. Hobbes denied the existence of immaterial souls and divine authority in politics, provoking accusations of heresy. His critics declared that not only should his books be burned, but perhaps he should be too. This hostility demonstrated just how threatening his argument seemed to both church and crown. Despite the storm, Hobbes's vision also left a lasting mark. His Leviathan depicted society as a giant made of smaller bodies. Each individual, by surrendering rights, became part of a collective power greater than themselves. The sovereign was not separate from the people, but composed of them, assembled into a single structure that stood above all. It was a mechanical, almost chilling image of politics, survival achieved by turning private individuals into components of a single, commanding whole. Later thinkers could not ignore him. Many rejected his embrace of absolute authority, but they had to grapple with the stark logic behind it. Once he framed the choice as order versus chaos, safety versus freedom, every subsequent political theory was forced to respond. Some insisted that his solution was worse than the problem, but even in contesting him, they worked on his terms. Hobbes's ideas have also resonated far beyond the 17th century. His clear, often mathematical way of reasoning about human behavior later led economists and political scientists to regard him as an early rational choice theorist. He outlined a model of individuals making decisions based on survival and self-interest, anticipating approaches that remain vital in contemporary political and economic analysis. This rational, stripped-back framing continues to influence how we think about power and cooperation. When you imagine Hobbes's Leviathan, think of a massive dam built to resist floodwaters. It keeps chaos at bay, protecting those behind it. However, the same structure also prevents liberty from flowing freely, diverting or extinguishing it to maintain stability. For Hobbes, that exchange was inevitable, and although he made a stronger case for obedience, he also revealed a flaw. The dam loses its authority the moment it fails to protect those inside. In summary, Hobbes established a framework that is both strict and persuasive, safety above everything else. Fear is the foundation of society. Obedience is dictated not by love or faith, but by rational calculation. He did not offer freedom as an ideal. He offered survival as the fundamental goal. That was his challenge and his legacy. But what if survival was not sufficient? What if, once secure, people started to demand more than just protection, seeking a voice in how they were governed? That question would soon lead to another thinker, one who presented a markedly different answer. John Locke presented a completely different view of political life: the right to refuse obedience. Born in 1642, he grew up during a time when England oscillated violently between monarchy, revolution, restoration, and uneasy compromise. As a child, he experienced the upheaval of the English Civil War. As an adult, he witnessed the execution of a king, the formation of a commonwealth, and the restoration of the monarchy. He even lived in exile for periods, cautious of persecution. These experiences convinced him that mere safety was not sufficient. Authority, if it was to be trusted, had to be based on something more substantial than fear. According to Locke, the instability of his time exposed the weakness of rulers who claimed legitimacy through divine right. Such claims might impose order, but they lacked the consent necessary to build lasting trust. England's bloody disputes over religion and monarchy demonstrated what happens when power rests solely on force and tradition. Locke's question was straightforward: how can a government maintain order without suppressing liberty? His answer was compelling. He argued that every human being naturally possesses rights, life, liberty, and property, before any government exists. Rulers do not give these rights. They belong to individuals simply by virtue of being human. Once stated, the implications were revolutionary. If rights come first, then governments are not creators of freedom, but guardians of it. To Locke, legitimate rule began not with heavenly mandate or military victory, but with consent. A sovereign without that consent was not only disliked, but also considered illegitimate. This marked a sharp contrast with the Hobbesian view that order must be secured at any cost. Where Hobbes rested on fear, Locke rested on trust given by choice. Any order lacking that choice, he cautioned, carried within it the seeds of collapse. Locke developed these ideas through his model of the social contract. People, he argued, relinquish part of their unlimited freedom in their natural state to live within a civil community. Instead of each person enforcing personal claims by force, they accept impartial law and enjoy the benefits of mutual protection. This contract was not forced upon them. Participation was voluntary. At the same time, he recognized a form of tacit consent. By residing in a community, using roads, owning land, or benefiting from protection, individuals signal agreement with the collective arrangement. However, this consent was conditional. If the government failed to protect natural rights, people retained the moral right to withdraw their consent. For Locke's contemporaries, this was a radical idea. Essentially, he was telling kings that their authority depended on the ongoing trust of their subjects, not on divine right. He argued that authority flows upwards from the people rather than downwards from heaven. If rulers breach the social contract by violating rights, the people have the right to dismiss them, even through revolution. This idea of the right to resist and replace leaders was his most controversial claim. During a time marked by political turmoil, it was more than just a theory. It served as a safeguard against tyranny. Central to Locke's framework was his theory of property. He argued that property arises not from a monarch's grant, but from labor. Every person, Locke emphasized, has property in their own body, and the labor of their body and the work of their hands are rightfully theirs. When someone combines that labor with common resources, those resources become private property. His example was simple. Water flowing in a fountain is common, but once you draw it into your pitcher, it becomes yours. By grounding property in personal labor, Locke regarded it as a natural extension of individual liberty. A government worthy of trust thus had a primary duty: to protect property. Without this, liberty lacked a secure foundation. But Locke also recognized limitations. He argued that God granted the world for all people to utilize. Property claims must be limited by fairness. You could take from the communal store, but not so much that it spoiled in your hands or deprived others of what they too needed. Importantly, Locke noted that people could rightfully own only what they could actually enjoy, without it going to waste. Anything beyond that would exceed their rightful share. With the invention of money, however, Locke observed that excess accumulation became possible without immediate harm to others, because money did not spoil. This marked a significant shift. Labor still grounded ownership. Still, the agreement to treat money as a durable store of value allowed considerable wealth inequalities without directly violating the natural law against waste. His recognition of these limits demonstrated that property was never meant to be absolute. It held both individual rights and communal obligations. What distinguished Locke was how he linked liberty directly with law itself. In his view, law did not merely stand above liberty. It derived its very force from liberty, because only through consent could laws be legitimate. This changed the relationship between freedom and order. No longer were they rivals, where security crushed liberty, or liberty threatened security. Instead, they stood as partners. Law provided safety for liberty, but freedom, through consent, gave law its legitimacy. Once consent was gone, law lost its claim to obedience. To understand this, Locke often used what today appears to be a simple analogy: a group contract. Everyone agrees that the rules must protect all their fundamental rights. As long as the terms are fair and upheld, the agreement remains valid. Break those terms, and members are justified in leaving or resisting. In this sense, political order was a living agreement, not lifelong slavery. The government could not demand endless obedience. It had to earn the loyalty of its citizens continually. The right to withdraw consent was not a threat to order, but its protector. By integrating this into politics, Locke reshaped the very concept of obedience. Obedience was no longer automatic, inherited, or coerced. It had to be a choice. He rendered revolution a legitimate act within political theory, not a destructive upheaval, but an authorized defense of natural rights. His framework centered on consent in politics, transforming subjects into citizens with a moral right to hold rulers accountable. This, more than any other idea, laid the groundwork for democratic thought. Locke's integration of natural rights, property, and consent established a broader view of limited government. It called for checks on concentrated authority because rulers with unchecked power were likely to abuse trust. He favored separating key government functions, assigning lawmaking to one body and law enforcement to another. The risk of combining all powers in one hand was tyranny. For Locke, division was not just theoretical, but essential to protect rights. The record of his lifetime confirmed this. Absolute monarchs in England had overreached, religious intolerance had deepened conflict, and sudden upheavals had shown that forced obedience could not guarantee peace. From this background, Locke concluded that a government must also be strong enough to protect rights. Consent and accountability, not fear, became the foundation of stability. The more people saw their participation as voluntary, the more likely they were to remain loyal. Trust, rather than coercion, created lasting order. This vision extended beyond his own century. Constitutional frameworks in later revolutions derived directly from Locke's argument that governments exist to protect the governed. His emphasis on legal equality, that even rulers are subject to the law, helped shape constitutions and bills of rights. By embedding natural rights into politics, Locke turned dissent into a principle. He provided oppressed subjects with a language for protest, not merely that a ruler was unkind or unpopular, but that their government had broken the contract and lost legitimacy. Consider the impact. When movements for democracy emerged, whether in struggles for representation, appeals to individual rights, or demands against arbitrary rule, Locke's model provided them with structure. It was no longer rebellion without cause, but a contractual renewal. By asserting that political authority was rooted in the people, he crafted a philosophy broad enough to justify both reform and revolution. One further refinement in his model was the concept of tacit consent. Even if you never explicitly signed a contract or cast a vote, your participation in society still counted as consent. Living under laws and benefiting from protections signaled agreement. However, crucially, this never abolished liberty. People could always withdraw. They might resist injustice or, in extreme cases, leave the community altogether. Tacit consent maintained social order, ongoing and renewed daily in life, but always remained conditional in principle. In Locke's model, then, consent underpins everything. Without it, laws break down into force, property becomes unstable, and liberty diminishes into tyranny. With consent, the government gains legitimacy. This was not a purely theoretical exercise. It was Locke's way of anchoring order in the dignity of those who lived under it. His argument was simple, but compelling. People do not merely obey. They decide whether obedience remains justified. This difference marked a significant step beyond Hobbes. While Hobbes aimed for stability by building a single permanent dam against chaos, Locke developed a system of channels through which liberty and order flowed together, overseen by the people who maintained them. Instead of fear enforcing obedience, trust and consent held society together. This was Locke's lasting contribution, the right to say no, inherent in each individual's ability to accept or reject a rule. And yet, even within Locke's carefully limited government, a question persisted. If consent relies on ongoing trust, how can you prevent any ruler or any institution from accruing excessive power and quietly suppressing liberty? That dilemma would challenge the next great thinker in this story. If rulers could not be trusted to preserve liberty, perhaps institutions could be trusted to do so. That was Montesquieu's guiding belief, who studied history and observed the same danger recurring. Whenever power became concentrated in too few hands, freedom diminished. In 18th century France, the monarchy wielded vast authority. Nobles, clergy, and magistrates vied for influence, but no formal system kept that power in check. Seeing this, Montesquieu asked a stark question. Could liberty survive if it depended solely on the virtue of rulers? His answer was clear. No. Liberty needs structure, not luck. Montesquieu's most renowned work, The Spirit of the Laws, was published in 1748. Dense, comprehensive, and systematic, it examined the principles by which societies organize themselves. He compared republics, monarchies, and despotic states, explaining what maintained each one. However, his most lasting contribution was the idea that liberty depends less on the wisdom of individual leaders and more on the design of political institutions. Montesquieu argued that we should expect rulers to be selfish, ambitious, or corrupt, and then create systems that prevent their flaws from leading to tyranny. For him, the danger was clear. Concentrated power always tempted abuse. Even a well-intentioned ruler could overreach their authority. Worse, no matter how benevolent a leader might be today, their successor could revoke liberties overnight. If freedom depended entirely on character, it was fragile. Montesquieu aimed for a system robust enough to outlast personal morality. His solution was to split state authority into separate branches, each designed to check and balance the others. This way, no single group or office could dominate unchecked. He identified three essential functions within government: the legislative, which makes laws, the executive, which implements them, and the judiciary, which settles disputes under them. If two of these powers were combined in the same hands, liberty would instantly collapse. For example, if the group that enacts laws also enforces them, it could create unfair rules and impose them on the public without restraint. Alternatively, if judges were dependent on lawmakers or rulers, their verdicts would merely reflect political interests rather than impartial justice. For Montesquieu, keeping all three separate became the key safeguard of freedom. A helpful way to understand this is through the analogy he himself promoted: a three-legged stool. Each branch of authority, legislative, executive, and judicial, is one leg. Remove one, and the stool collapses. But with all three supporting each other, the structure remains steady even under pressure. Similarly, a state with separate branches can resist ambition, conflict, and corruption without slipping into despotism. Montesquieu's insight was that liberty does not depend on rulers being virtuous. Instead, it can be safeguarded by the very structure of government. This transformed the debate entirely. Politics was no longer simply about the will of the ruler at the top. It became focused on mechanisms intentionally designed to slow and balance the exercise of power. Power was not held by a single block, but spread across a structure built with checks, gaps, and safeguards. For Montesquieu, liberty existed only when no part of government could dominate without facing resistance. Political freedom was therefore not a benevolent gift bestowed upon subjects. Instead, it was a fundamental right that individuals possessed. It was a condition created through balance. Alongside this structural solution, Montesquieu introduced another aspect. Laws should never be viewed as abstract. Instead, they originate from what he termed the general spirit of a people. Many factors influence this spirit: climate, religion, customs, habits, manners, and existing forms of government. For example, he noted that societies in warmer regions often developed different patterns of life and laws compared to those in colder areas, due to variations in agriculture, trade, and even social temperament. Religion also affected political order, as did long-established customs and daily civic practices. Montesquieu's point was that effective laws needed to accommodate these conditions rather than overlook them. This realization broadened his view beyond a simple rulebook for governments. He regarded law as part of a larger fabric that included environment, culture, and tradition. A system that functions well in one region might fail in another if it does not align with the society's spirit. Therefore, liberty requires not only institutional safeguards, but also sensitivity to context. Ignoring the cultural and social environment risks producing laws that are empty and rejected by the very people they aim to govern. For Montesquieu, liberty depends both on the design of institutions and on tailoring those designs to a people's lived experience. He also identified the fundamental principles he believed united different states. In a republic, he thought the binding principle was virtue, a public spirit where individuals prioritize the common good over private aims. In monarchies, he pointed to honor, where personal ambition and pride fuel loyalty within the framework of legal authority. In despotic regimes, by contrast, he saw that fear was the only principle maintaining order, because no lawful constraints limited the ruler's command. These categories explained why republics required widespread civic virtue, why monarchies balanced service with status, and why despotisms descended into intimidation. Liberty, in his view, could only be sustained in the first two, when power was divided and bound by law. Turning to the executive, Montesquieu emphasized that stability in this branch was crucial. Rapid decisions were sometimes necessary, and for that reason, he believed executive power could be effectively concentrated in a single ruler. However, he insisted that such a figure must face limits. A king or president might have the authority to veto laws passed by the legislature, but the legislature must also serve as a counterweight, preventing executive overreach. These mutual restraints kept ambition in check without paralyzing the government. The influence of these ideas extended well beyond Montesquieu's France. Consider later models of government where power is divided among three branches: legislative, executive, and judicial, and where no branch can act entirely alone. Legislatures can pass laws, but executives have the power to veto them. Executives can enforce laws, but courts can rule their actions unlawful. Courts may interpret laws, but only laws that are correctly passed and enacted hold validity. This system of checks and balances reflects Montesquieu's vision of liberty protected by design rather than chance. What makes his theory striking is not its complexity, but its pragmatic realism. Montesquieu recognized human flaws instead of denying them. Leaders would chase power, legislatures would overreach, and judges could be tempted. His architecture of power anticipated those weaknesses and prevented them from destroying liberty. For him, good government functioned like sound engineering. It had to withstand storms, not just mild weather. Order and freedom could coexist, but only if government was designed to manage conflict, not ignore it. At the same time, he reminded readers that no structure operates in isolation. Laws that conflict with local customs, or that fail to respect climate, economy, or religion, lose their effectiveness. Institutional checks are essential, but so is cultural compatibility. A society's spirit is larger than its rulers or even its legal codes. Upholding liberty requires harmony between structure and context. The immediate benefit of this theory was the clarity it provided. Montesquieu demonstrated that the conflict between order and freedom did not have to result in one side overpowering the other. By dividing power and ensuring each branch can check the others, freedom became dependable, even when individuals are selfish or corrupt. Liberty, in his framework, was not about trusting leaders to act appropriately. It was a foreseeable result of institutions designed to mitigate human weakness. The impact of the spirit of the laws was significant. Throughout Europe, and later in North America, reformers and constitutional creators adopted his concept of separation of powers as a fundamental principle. Monarchs striving for enlightened reform looked to him for guidance. Revolutionaries aiming to overthrow old regimes quoted his warnings against concentrated authority. His emphasis on dividing governance into 3 branches, with deliberate checks and balances, became a key feature of subsequent democratic systems. Montesquieu's legacy, therefore, was simple but profound. Liberty would not endure on good intentions alone. It depended on deliberate checks on power, well-balanced institutions, and laws that reflected the culture of a people. He transformed political freedom from a fragile quality that relied on a ruler's character into a lasting structure capable of enduring through generations. When you examine modern systems where each branch of government limits the others, yet none can rule alone, you see his influence. For Montesquieu, liberty stemmed from a well-structured system of governance. Balance itself was a safeguard of freedom. But that raised one more question. If liberty is protected by checks and balances, whose voice ultimately determines the rules under which people live? What if freedom meant obeying laws that you yourself had a hand in creating? For Jean-Jacques Rousseau, this was the essence of political liberty. He argued that as long as people lived under domination, whether by monarchs, aristocrats, or even the weight of social expectations, they were not truly free. To reclaim freedom, political authority had to come from the collective body of citizens. He called this authority the general will, and it became the core of his political vision. But Rousseau's concept of the general will was not merely the sum of majority votes. He warned that if political life reduced to a contest of personal desires, each person asking, "What benefits me?" it would lead to endless competition and conflict. Instead, the general will represented a higher aim towards the common good, where individuals set aside narrow self-interest and asked, "What benefits the community as a whole?" This was his path to true liberty, individuals gaining greater freedom by submitting their wills to a collectively created law. Yet Rousseau's idea carried a paradox. He claimed that only by joining in the common good could one become free, but this created space for authority to step in and say, "You may think you know your interest, but I, as the expression of the general will, know better. If you resist, then you must be forced to be free." This critique has echoed throughout his theory ever since. His commitment to civic liberty inspired movements for democracy. Still, it also carried a darker potential, the risk that the general will could be used to silence dissent in the name of unity. That is why Rousseau's work invites debate from the very beginning. It is both empowering and dangerous at the same time. The philosophy behind this idea originated from Rousseau's perspective on human nature. He believed that society, as it existed, had corrupted people. In their natural state, humans were simple, compassionate, and motivated by what he called amour de soi, a fundamental form of self-love based on self-preservation. This was a healthy and uncompetitive environment. In contrast, social life introduced amour propre, a self-love measured against others, founded on comparison, pride, and envy. Where soi signifies oneself without reference to others, propre means oneself only in relation to other people. Rousseau believed that amour propre led to jealousy, rivalry, and inequality, corrupting natural goodness. Society, by fostering this dependence on status, had transformed free beings into petty competitors. His idea of the general will was an attempt to restore this corruption, to shift individuals from self-centered comparison back towards a shared commitment that benefits everyone equally. For Rousseau, the stakes could not have been higher. He argued that liberty was not doing whatever one liked. Left unchecked, private desires clashed and created inequality. True liberty involved placing personal wishes under laws you and your fellow citizens made yourselves. By exchanging unrestrained impulses, constantly at risk from the stronger or wealthier, for collective self-rule, you gained more than you lost. Civic liberty provided protection and dignity far superior to private, insecure independence. Obedience to the general will, paradoxically, was the only way to be truly free. Imagine a group of singers rehearsing together. Each voice has its own strength and rhythm. If all sing independently, the result is a jumble of sound. However, if each adjusts slightly and follows the shared score, a harmony emerges that no individual could create on their own. Rousseau saw politics in the same way. Yielding a measure of independence to join in the general will does not destroy liberty. It enriches it, creating a harmony of voices that lifts the whole. Still, Rousseau recognized the dangers lurking in his idea. The general will was not the same as the will of all, which he defined as the total of private interests. It was something different, a common orientation towards justice and the communal good. Yet he admitted that society could easily confuse the two. A majority might mistake private preferences for the general will, imposing its narrow views as if they represented the views of everyone. Here lay the central risk, that appealing to the general will might mask acts of oppression, allowing a majority to silence the minority while claiming to defend liberty. This uncertainty was why Rousseau emphasized the importance of direct participation. In smaller communities where citizens could assemble, listen, and deliberate face-to-face, the general will was more likely to emerge. Large societies posed a greater problem. Representation threatened to sever the link between people and their sovereign authority. Delegating power risked losing sight of the authentic common good. Rousseau took this so seriously that he declared, "The moment a people gives itself representatives, it is no longer free." That claim still unsettles contemporary political theory. His vision relied on active citizen engagement, not delegation. Despite this tension, Rousseau's model held a transformative potential. Unlike Hobbes, who relied on sovereign power, or Locke, who based authority on consent limited by rights, Rousseau anchored authority in the people as a united body. The foundation of society was not fear of punishment or private interest, but shared commitment. Everyone participated, everyone bound themselves by standard rules, and all stood equal under the civic bond. Political liberty was not freedom from rules, but freedom through rules, rules created and accepted collectively. Rousseau sharply illustrated this divide through his contrast between the citizen and the bourgeois. The bourgeois was someone driven by private interest, property, wealth, and reputation. The citizen, on the other hand, was committed to the collective good represented by the general will. For Rousseau, the transition from bourgeois to citizen was central to political liberty. A society filled with bourgeois individuals, absorbed in selfish pursuits, could never sustain true freedom. Only when people saw themselves as citizens, willing to prioritize the community over personal advantage, could the civic order flourish. He also voiced his concerns about education. In his work, Émile, Rousseau argued that children are born inherently good, motivated by an innate love of themselves, known as amour propre or amour de soi. Society, through fostering amour propre, often corrupts this innate goodness by encouraging children to seek approval and engage in comparison. Proper education, according to him, should safeguard and nurture independence, fostering a sense of inner dignity rather than reliance on external praise. His educational vision was, in many ways, radical. However, at the same time, Rousseau held conventional and limiting views on gender. He maintained that men and women were fundamentally different, with women made specially to please men. This assertion highlighted the contradictions within his philosophy. While advocating for liberty and self-governance, he also supported structures of inequality. At the heart of Rousseau's political theory was the principle of popular sovereignty. He maintained that only the people, organized as a collective body, could grant themselves legitimate laws. Sovereignty could never be held by monarchs, aristocrats, or representatives acting permanently in others' names. Political power was to be exercised directly by citizens, or it would lose its legitimacy. In this view, obedience was not subjugation. It was authorship. To obey the general will was to follow one's own law as a citizen among equals. The revolutionary impact of this claim was tremendous. Movements advocating democracy and popular rule adopted Rousseau's language to justify new political orders. He provided philosophical support to the idea that true sovereignty belonged to the people, not rulers. However, he also recognized the inherent risk within the concept of the general will. If used carelessly, it could justify silencing dissenters, thereby reducing freedom, even as it claimed to defend it. This double-edged nature made his thoughts both inspiring and profoundly concerning. That tension is what makes Rousseau's work so important even today. You can see his question alive in every democracy today. How do we balance majority rule with individual rights? How do we ensure that collective choice reflects the common good, not just numbers? Rousseau's warning remains: unless citizens commit to seeing beyond private advantage, democracy degenerates into domination by opinion rather than liberation by shared law. The work of cultivating civic character is as central as ballots or institutions. For Rousseau, then, joining a community meant more than simply cohabiting. It necessitated an ethical change, from private individuals pursuing personal gain to citizens shaping a shared life. Liberty was not private enjoyment, but public authorship. His theory demonstrated how order and freedom could support each other rather than oppose one another. Under the general will, order derived from consensus, and freedom came from collective self-governance. History demonstrates both the peril and the potential. His ideas resonated in revolutionary manifestos, influenced declarations of rights, and inspired efforts to base government on citizen assemblies. However, they also served as warnings of how easily appeals to the general will could lead to pressure for conformity. Rousseau himself predicted this. The very principle that enables freedom can, when misused, restrict it. So Rousseau left behind both a blueprint and a dilemma. He proposed a society where each voice joins in harmony, fostering greater freedom together. However, He also demonstrated that the chorus can sometimes overshadow the individual voice. Which outcome prevails depends on how carefully societies maintain the balance between individual rights and collective good, between citizen and bourgeois. This is why Rousseau's general will remains one. It is one of the most influential and debated ideas in political thought. It provided revolutions with a rallying cry, but also served as a warning against the majority. His vision compelled political theory to address both the potential and the risks of collective sovereignty. Moreover, it laid the groundwork for a different concern: the suspicion that the greatest threat to individual liberty might not come from kings and rulers at all, but from the pressure exerted by one's own neighbors. John Stuart Mill made liberty his central concern. In the 19th century, he became convinced that the greatest threat to personal freedom was not only the power of governments, but also the pressure of society itself. He observed how opinion, fashion, and expectation could weigh as heavily as laws and armies. Obedience was demanded not by rulers, but by neighbors and peers, enforcing conformity through disapproval. For Mill, this social pressure was no less oppressive than political despotism, and perhaps more insidious because it rarely appeared in such terms. This recognition of what he called the tyranny of the majority became the foundation of his most famous book, On Liberty. Mill believed that liberty was essential for the growth of both individuals and societies. He asked, how can freedom endure in a culture where disapproval can suppress difference without a single law being enacted? Physical coercion is straightforward, he argued, but social coercion, where the crowd silences dissent, not only removes liberty, but also masks its absence as common sense. This makes it more difficult to oppose. To defend liberty, Mill started where he believed the danger was greatest: speech and expression. In On Liberty, he argued that even unpopular, false, or offensive opinions should be expressed. Silencing them closed the door to truth. Even mistaken ideas hold value because they reveal flaws in arguments we accept without question. Without challenge, a belief, even if correct, becomes unexamined and merely repeated out of habit. Mill had a sharp phrase for this: truth without challenge becomes dead dogma. A society that suppresses dissent, he contended, loses the ability to distinguish between living knowledge and empty recitation. He took it further. Suppose an idea has reigned unchallenged for generations. People still speak it and defend it, but if no one dares to test it, does anyone truly understand why it's true? For Mill, the answer was no. An unopposed truth becomes lifeless, its force drained away. By permitting even blatant falsehoods to be voiced, society keeps truth alive by making defense a continual act of reasoning. A censored society leaves itself blind to its mistakes and stagnant in its thinking. From speech, Mill expanded his focus to encompass all aspects of individual liberty. He articulated a straightforward principle: each person should be free to live as they choose, as long as they do not cause harm to others. Known as the harm principle, this became the foundation of his liberalism. You might disapprove of how your neighbor spends their time or the opinions they hold, but disapproval alone does not justify interference. Society or the state may only intervene when someone's actions cause actual harm to another person. This principle drew a line. Freedom did not end at the edge of majority tastes. It ended only when another person's security or rights were violated. Annoyance, disgust, or disagreement were not reasons to stop others. In Mill's view, unless actual harm was at stake, diversity in thought and lifestyle enriched society. Collectively, This meant tolerating eccentricity, experimentation, and minority expression. The harm principle was his shield against conformity, protecting difference as essential to human flourishing. But Mill's framework raised a lasting challenge: how to define harm. Was it only physical injury? Did it include psychological damage or the indirect effects of social influence? He recognized the ambiguity, but believed the principle still offered the most solid boundary. Without it, liberty would always be at the mercy of changing opinions. With it, people had at least a consistent defense of individuality against both government coercion and community pressure. To understand what Mill envisioned, imagine a path across open ground. Each person can walk it differently: fast, slow, in circles, or straight. There is only one rule: you must not trample on another's path. As long as your steps do not crush theirs, yours remain your own. This image captures Mill's idea of liberty: being free to chart your own course paired with the duty to respect others' freedom to do the same. Mill did not leave these ideas in the realm of theory. He confronted the injustices of his own time and applied his principles. Nowhere was this clearer than in his defense of women's liberty. In 19th century Britain, women had little control over property, few chances for education, and no role in politics. Mill described their subjugation as a form of slavery. In The Subjection of Women, he advocated for reform, including equal rights in marriage, the right to education, and full political participation. He argued that a society divided against equality loses half of its genius. By excluding women from education, work, and public activity, humanity wastes potential. He proposed that marriage, far from being a relation of dominance, should be a partnership of equals. True companionship, he believed, arises not from enforced obedience, but from shared respect. Equality is not only fair, it also promises to unleash creativity, insight, and growth that oppression has long stifled. Behind his advocacy lay a personal partnership. For years, Mill collaborated closely with Harriet Taylor, a radical thinker who profoundly influenced his ideas. She challenged 19th century assumptions about marriage and women's dependence, and Mill recognized that her insights sharpened his views on liberty and equality. Their relationship demonstrated that his arguments were more than just abstract notions. They were tested through discussion, enriched by another's mind, and rooted in genuine connection. Mill thus redefined liberty as more than a shield against chains or absolute power. He regarded it as the foundation of a thriving community. A free society was not merely one that prevented harm. It fostered diverse ways of living, thinking, and experimenting. He reminded his readers that progress, whether in science, art, or social reform, relied on individuals willing to challenge custom and take risks against majority opinion. Yet critics raised concerns. What if someone's actions caused no direct harm but still fostered widespread fear or instability? Or what about cases where harm is less obvious, embedded within social interactions? These complexities made applying the harm principle precisely challenging. Nonetheless, Mill believed that the clarity of his proposal provided the most vigorous defense for liberty. A loose or flexible definition of harm could always lead to over or under suppression. His formula was strict yet robust, establishing liberty on a solid foundation, even if future generations had to navigate the finer details. Mill's vision created a society where each person contributed to the collective richness, not through conformity, but via diversity. Freedom of conscience meant religion could not demand uniformity. Freedom of discussion meant no perspective, however radical, could be silenced. Freedom of lifestyle meant 1,000 ways of living, many regarded as eccentric, could still enrich society without being crushed under the weight of convention. For Mill, these freedoms were inseparable. Seen in this light, liberty was more than just permission. It was the foundation for human beings to realize their potential. Suppressed liberty caused stagnation. Protected liberty fostered creativity and growth. The aim was a society strong not in uniformity, but in diversity, where individuality was valued and respected. His message was clear. If liberty is not safeguarded, communities do not merely lose freedom, they also lose their identity. They lose the opportunity to develop. At the core of Mill's philosophy was dignity. Every individual deserves the opportunity to make their own choices. Community had a role, but not in forcing uniformity. Its purpose was to define the limits within which individuality could thrive. Mill's liberal democracy thus became a system that valued uniqueness, not as mere eccentricity, but as vital to progress. Strong societies were those that permitted many different paths to exist side by side without dominating one another. Imagine this society as a lively square, people talking, debating, contradicting, and inventing new ideas. Not all voices agree, but all voices have space. Uncommon views are not silenced. They provoke questions. The difference is not suppressed, but acknowledged as applicable. And in this square, men and women stand as equals, not out of courtesy, but by right. For Mill, such a vision demonstrated what liberal democracy could be, not just majority rule, but individual dignity preserved against both rulers and crowds. Critics have since expanded on his ideas, questioning whether any society can clearly distinguish harm from offense, or if indirect injury should also be considered. These concerns persist. Yet the framework Mill established, a principle based on respect for individuality and the rejection of unchecked conformity, continues to shape debates over liberty today. To Mill, the most potent force to challenge was not monarchs or soldiers, but the quiet power of social opinion when it demanded obedience. He countered this not by rejecting society, but by outlining the principles that could safeguard space for individuality within it. With liberty rooted in speech, choice, and equality, he developed a philosophy that regarded difference as a source of progress, not a threat. This left an open question. Mill had demonstrated how principles could protect liberty within society. But could liberty itself, particularly the private pursuit of personal interest, somehow produce social order without deliberate design? The next thinker sought to explain exactly that. Could the free pursuit of self-interest generate not chaos but order? Adam Smith believed so. At first glance, individuals seeking their own benefit may seem like a recipe for confusion. Everyone rushing for profit, grabbing resources, and competing against one another. However, in Smith's view, these actions create a surprising and stable pattern that benefits society and connects people well beyond their own intentions. Smith focused on everyday life rather than abstract systems. He explored how people bartered, traded, and exchanged. To him, these exchanges were not solely about profit. They were influenced by sympathy, reputation, and the social standing people aimed to uphold. He believed that economics could only be understood when combined with moral life. Humans do not act as numbers, but as beings seeking dignity, security, and recognition. The puzzle is simple. If everyone pursues only personal goals, why doesn't society fall apart into endless competition and distrust? Smith responded with his well-known concept of the invisible hand. He reasoned that through voluntary exchange, individuals unintentionally support others while pursuing their own interests. A merchant might sell grain for a profit, and buyers might purchase just to feed themselves. Yet both sides benefit. The buyer eats, and the seller earns a profit. When this process happens across thousands of transactions, the entire community ends up supplied, nourished, and sustained without any central authority directing it. The invisible hand is credited with coining the term for this process of unintended order. It demonstrated that widespread cooperation could arise from numerous separate pursuits. A society guided by prices and needs, rather than decrees, managed to coordinate activities more effectively than a ministry planning every exchange. Smith recognized this as a profound truth. Liberty in trade was not the enemy of order, but one of its most dependable sources. The division of labor provided this idea with its clearest example. In The Wealth of Nations, Smith explained how dividing production into specialized roles boosted productivity well beyond what any individual worker could reach. His pin factory example demonstrated how 10 people, each performing a part in the process, could produce thousands of pins per day, whereas working alone, they might manage only a few. Specialization increased efficiency, cut wasted effort, and grew wealth. In this, order arose not from good intentions, but from practical work arrangements. To illustrate, think of an ant colony. No single ant directs the others, nor does any architect lay plans. Each ant follows simple aims, yet together they create an intricate mound, a structure far greater than any individual intention. For Smith, the market functions similarly. From countless local decisions, a vast system of production and exchange emerges, more sophisticated than rulers could ever design in advance. But Smith did not confuse efficiency with perfection. He understood that repetitive specialization had drawbacks. A worker dedicating their life to perfecting a narrow movement might lose the ability to exercise broader skills or judgment. For Smith, economic growth had to be accompanied by moral development and education. He cautioned that without robust institutions to foster knowledge, division of labor would limit people's abilities and weaken their humanity. Growth alone could not sustain a society if citizens became, in his words, as stupid and ignorant as a human creature can become. Therefore, education and moral training were vital companions to economic liberty. This balance between gain and sympathy pervades his thought. Long before The Wealth of Nations, Smith's theory of moral sentiments emphasized that humans care deeply about how they are perceived. People seek approval, esteem, and the sympathy of others, not merely wealth. This inner desire for recognition restrains selfish impulses. A trader might cheat for quick gain, but if losing honor invites scorn, the calculation changes. Smith described the impartial spectator, an internalized sense of how others would judge us, as a hidden regulator of behavior. Such moral sentiments temper greed and uphold trust in daily exchanges. This meant that markets did not rise solely based on self-interest. They relied equally on moral checks and social bonds. Remove sympathy, and self-interest devolves into exploitation. Remove liberty, and sympathy has no space to function. Together, they formed the basis for trust. Contracts were honored, exchanges were fair, and communities were maintained through reputation and conscience. Smith's critique of mercantilism demonstrates this. Mercantilist governments hoarded gold and imposed tariffs, believing that the quantity of metal measured wealth. But Smith argued that wealth resides in productivity, in what labor produces and exchanges. Artificial restrictions, he thought, only distort natural flows of trade, hindering the invisible hand. Free trade enables goods to move to where they are most valued, spreading prosperity through voluntary exchange. Conversely, interference hampers the system's natural self-coordination and makes nations poorer. His labor theory of value supported this view, especially in earlier simple societies. Smith argued that the labor measured the worth of goods it took to produce them. Labor, he wrote, is the real measure of the exchangeable value of all commodities. In more advanced economies, other factors, land, capital, rents, entered the calculation, but labor remained central. The distribution of income reflected the contributions of each group: wages to workers, profits to capitalists, and rent to landowners. Wealth was rooted not in currency or metallic stores, but in human exertion transformed into valuable goods. This point later inspired thinkers to both expand upon and critique Smith. Some radicalized his claim, arguing that when profit exceeded wages, workers were being exploited. Smith stopped short of that conclusion. However, he clearly stated that wealth was primarily created through labor, a fact often overlooked in simple portrayals of his work. His analysis thus integrated economic, moral, and social strands. Division of labor increased wealth, sympathy prevented abuse, free trade coordinated exchange, labor underpinned value. The invisible hand illustrated how individual actions produced a structure nobody anticipated. However, it was not a mystical force. It was the sum of ordinary behavior, driven by motives deeper than greed alone. It is worth noting how sparingly Smith himself used the phrase invisible hand. It appears only 3 times across his work, each with a different meaning. In the theory of moral sentiments, it had theological overtones, suggesting providential balance. In The Wealth of Nations, it referred to merchants preferring home trade, almost an aside about international exchange rather than domestic markets. Only later did the term ascend to its modern status as shorthand for free markets everywhere. Smith was subtler than his current reputation suggests, and that lingering subtlety keeps his ideas open to reinterpretation even today. Many misremember Smith as advocating boundless selfishness. In reality, he argued that selfishness unmoderated by sympathy erodes trust and order. Likewise, sympathy without liberty leads to stagnation and decline. Only when both freedom and compassion operate together can society flourish. He recognized that markets could elevate prosperity, but also understood the dangers of their effects, which is why education and moral development must accompany economic policy. For Smith, the most significant benefit was this: order did not require rulers to command or individuals to sacrifice self-interest entirely. It arose from people trading, working, and seeking recognition within a social fabric. Profit served needs, reputation enforced honesty, and sympathy linked neighbors together. In this balance, liberty became compatible with cohesion. Think of his system as a loom. Every thread represents a person's decision to trade, to work, or to pursue standing. No one designs the entire pattern, but the threads interlace, held by tension and sympathy, to form fabric. This fabric, constituting the functioning economy and society, was what Smith brought into view. It is delicate, requiring constant moral fibers to hold it together, but it is vastly stronger and more complex than any authority could weave on its own. That is why his influence persisted. He challenged the restrictions of mercantilism, emphasized productivity and trade, revealed the efficiency of the division of labor, and asserted that moral bonds were as essential as economic liberty. His work offered not only economic theory, but also a vision of how everyday pursuits could stabilize social order. Yet Smith himself hinted at limits. Division of labor risked narrowing minds. Free trade promised wealth, but it also exposed existing inequalities. Sympathy regulated behavior. But what if sympathies shifted or failed? His model invited reflection, not only on what builds order, but also on where its weaknesses lie. For Smith, the answer was to strengthen educational institutions, uphold moral values, and preserve compassion within economic life. Ultimately, his invisible hand was less a divine mystery than a human pattern, a name for how liberty and sentiment, commerce and conscience intertwined to form society. It remains compelling because it demonstrates how order can emerge without anyone designing it, yet it also clarifies that order is not guaranteed to appear. The fibers must be maintained, or the fabric will fray. And behind this insight lies a bigger question. If Smith based freedom on sympathy and moral bonds, what if those very values are not foundations, but constraints? What if the guideposts we trust become chains that bind us? That was the challenge posed by the following great figure, who questioned whether morality itself might be more of a prison than a path. Friedrich Nietzsche viewed morality not as an eternal truth, but as something created and reshaped through human struggles. He proposed that the values we inherit are not timeless, but are manufactured, formed in the workshop of power, resentment, and survival. What people called good and evil were never fixed categories. For him, morality was less a revelation than a history passed down until it became ingrained as a habit. To illustrate this, Nietzsche developed what he called genealogy, a method for examining values by tracing their origins and transformations. Instead of accepting morality at face value, he compared how the same ideas shifted across different cultures. He observed that good once described qualities of the noble, healthy, and strong, those who set the standards. Bad referred to those beneath them, those ruled, often the poor, the weak, or those considered outsiders. In fact, the original distinction arose from what he described as a master race that saw itself as inherently good, while those under its rule, the subjected, often conquered peoples, were simply marked as bad. Over the centuries, that hierarchy of meaning underwent dramatic changes. Nietzsche contended that religions supporting the powerless, especially the Jewish and later Christian traditions, initiated what he called a slave revolt in morality. Unable to confront noble rulers directly, the powerless resorted to a radical revaluation. Out of resentment, what Nietzsche termed ressentiment, they condemned the virtues of their oppressors. Pride became evil. Strength was viewed as cruelty. Assertiveness was regarded as a vice. Conversely, traits associated with weakness, such as humility, compassion, and obedience, were elevated as the highest virtues. The moral hierarchy was thereby inverted. In his view, this slave revolt transformed the moral fabric of civilization. What once represented vitality and independence was labeled as corruption, while submission and gentleness were praised. Nietzsche recognized this as an ingenious survival strategy, but also saw it as the start of decline. By institutionalizing resentment as virtue, humanity suppressed instincts that provided energy and vitality. We inherited a morality of guilt, suspicion, and equalizing, one that restrained greatness in the name of safety. This contrast became more pronounced in Nietzsche's portrayal of master morality versus slave morality. Master morality celebrated life, with the strong defining themselves as good, recognizing their vitality as noble, and dismissing the weaker as insignificant or bad. Conversely, slave morality was rooted in resentment. It branded the powerful as evil and elevated weakness as good. Humility, patience, and compassion were praised not because they fostered flourishing, but because they restrained domination. Nietzsche believed modern societies had become so immersed in this morality of the herd that its values felt universal and unquestioned, even though they were historically constructed. That posed a troubling question. If morals are merely products of conflict and invention, what can people rely on? Nietzsche's most well-known assertion addressed this. God is dead. By this, he did not mean a literal death, but the loss of faith in eternal foundations. Modern culture has observed its religious certainties weaken, but along with them went belief in absolute truth or universal moral law. What was left was an emptiness. Without eternal guideposts, you face the world without inherited maps. The old map analogy helps clarify this in your mind. Imagine travelers who have relied for centuries on routes sketched long ago. Suddenly, the rivers shift, the landmarks vanish, and the roads are erased. You sweep the old map off the table. There is now freedom. Each explorer can chart their own way, but also terror, because all direction must be drawn anew. That was Nietzsche's picture of modern existence once divine authority had collapsed. He believed this collapse was both an opportunity and a risk. The risk was nihilism, the despairing sense that life had no meaning at all. People might cling weakly to old codes even after losing faith in them, or simply surrender to a state of emptiness. Yet the opportunity was liberation, the chance for individuals to become creators of values. Without pre-written truths, there was space to generate meaning and to live by standards crafted rather than imposed. That was his demand, to face emptiness directly and, through courage, transform it into something new. At the center of this demand was the idea of self-overcoming. Nietzsche urged individuals to cease obeying the herd, to reject conformity disguised as morality, and to test their own limits. True freedom was not rights or reforms granted by authorities, which he often saw as expressions of resentment, but the act of mastering oneself and creating values from strength. This journey, he acknowledged, was perilous. It entailed shouldering responsibility without guarantees, standing without the comfort of higher powers. His name for the figure who embodied this possibility was the Übermensch, often translated as Overman or Superman. This was not a dictator or conqueror. The Übermensch was someone who had transcended slave morality, moved beyond guilt and meek virtues, and generated new values rooted in affirmation. It was not a prophecy of a historical figure, but a symbol, a guiding possibility for what humanity might achieve if it chose creation over resignation. Living this way meant recognizing freedom as a continuous act of creation. The Übermensch did not inherit truths. He or she crafted them. This ideal opposed both nihilism and conformity, embodying the courage to face a valueless world by bestowing it new meaning. Yet Nietzsche did not overlook the cost. Modern societies, he believed, had become filled with bad air, a stifling mediocrity. In his view, people had grown thin, flattened, and deprived of vitality. By prioritizing compassion and equality above all, culture drained ambition and dulled strength. Instead of aiming for greatness, people sought safety and sameness. That leveling, he lamented, hindered human potential. The issue, as he perceived it, was not kindness itself, but its transformation into an absolute rule. With the highest and only command, individuals suppressed their instinct, drive, and excellence. Ambition was labeled arrogance, pride was called sin, and strength was regarded as brutality. Humanity drifted towards conformity and away from self-overcoming. For Nietzsche, that represented spiritual stagnation. Greatness was exchanged for comfort, and vitality constrained by guilt. Through his genealogical approach, Nietzsche revealed the fragility of values. He contrasted the shifting notions of good, bad, and evil over time. What was noble in one era became criminal in the next. Justice, fairness, piety, each emerged not as eternal constants, but as outcomes of shifting power. This view stripped morality of its timeless pedestal and returned the task of judgment to humans. That left the unsettling question: can any stable order exist if values are merely constructed? Nietzsche's response was clear. Herd morality provides order, but order is bought at the expense of vitality. If you sought a fuller life, you had to accept chaos alongside possibility. Safety lay with inherited morality, but true freedom meant making your own decisions without appeals to truths written in the sky. His argument, therefore, shifted focus onto the individual. To reject imposed morality was to take on the burden of creating meaning. Order was no longer assured by obedience alone. It had to be continually reconstructed by those brave enough to do so. This was freedom as a challenge, not comfort. A liberty measured not in rights granted, but in strength tested. For Nietzsche, the modern age stood at a crossroads. Mediocrity, soft morals, and conformism characterized one path. The other, more challenging route, involved self-overcoming in opposition to the pull of conformity. He believed most people would choose the herd, retreating into the comfort of inherited values. Only a few would undertake the riskier task of creating new values. Nevertheless, even the existence of such individuals revealed humanity's potential for transformation. That is why Nietzsche continues to unsettle. His ideas strip away certainty, leaving you with freedom raw and unprotected. There is no guarantee of safety, only the possibility of authenticity. In dismantling accepted categories, he offered no simple replacement. Instead, he urged individuals to become creators of their own lives. For many, it can be overwhelming. For some, it is the greatest challenge. His legacy is therefore two-sided. On one hand, it dismantles the old scaffolding of morality, revealing it as history and power disguised as truth. On the other hand, it issues a challenge to construct new scaffolding yourself. The cost is isolation, doubt, and the absence of ready-made rules. The reward is originality, the chance to live a life that is uniquely your own. Nietzsche leaves you with that burden. If morality is a workshop of chains, then freedom lies in forging your own tools. However, doing so means accepting the void left behind and having the strength to create your own map where one does not exist. And it prompts another question. If society's rules are fragile, what about the forces within you that influence your choices? What if the tension between order and freedom isn't just external, but embedded deep within the mind itself? Sigmund Freud applied this idea directly to the mind. He proposed that the most significant barriers to freedom were not only external, but also within your own inner life, where hidden forces tugged at every decision you made. Beneath the calm exterior of reason, he believed, there were powerful drives and repressed conflicts that never lost their strength. For him, liberty was never entirely free from influence. It was always intertwined with unconscious pressures you did not fully control. Freud first recognized these pressures in his patients. He met people suffering from tremors, compulsions, anxieties, and symptoms with no apparent physical cause. What medicine could not find in the body, he suspected, existed instead in the mind. From this, his most famous and unsettling assertion emerged. Beneath conscious thought lies an unconscious realm. In this shadow territory dwell desires, fears, and memories pushed out of sight, but not out of influence. They continue to work from beneath, affecting outward choices in ways that are difficult to acknowledge. Repression became Freud's central term for this process. People bury instincts that are too disruptive or shameful to admit, keeping them unconscious to ensure social survival. Most of these instincts revolve around sexuality and aggression, which, to Freud, explains why conflicts rooted in childhood leave such deep marks on adulthood. Early attachments and rivalries, if unresolved, are repressed but not erased. Later, they re-emerge indirectly through dreams, slips of the tongue, or neurotic symptoms. This tension between instinct and restraint becomes the focus of his book Civilization and Its Discontents. Freud emphasized a stark point. Modern civilization itself is a form of repression. To live together, individuals must relinquish many of their instinctual gratifications. Society demands that aggression be restrained, sexuality suppressed, and private urges subordinated to rules. Without these restraints, cooperation breaks down into violence. Yet each restriction leaves a residue of dissatisfaction. Our bodies and minds desire more than civilization allows, so inner frustration never truly vanishes. Order depends on repression, but repression likewise fosters discontent. To describe this internal struggle in detail, Freud outlined his model of the psyche, comprising the id, ego, and superego. The id is the raw force of desire. It functions on immediate impulse, without awareness of consequences, merely the cry, "I want." The superego stands in opposition, embodying society's rules and morality. However, this superego is not abstract. It originates in childhood, when parental authority leaves its imprint on the mind structure. Parental prohibitions and expectations are internalized and transformed into the voice of the superego. It continues to scold, judge, and demand discipline long after the actual parents have gone from the scene. Between these extremes lies the ego, attempting to find a compromise, trying to satisfy some desire without breaking rules too harshly, to maintain both inner peace and social order. This dynamic is perhaps best imagined as a household argument. One voice shouts for indulgence, another for restraint, while a third, weary of both, struggles to prevent the household from falling apart. Peace never endures. Each quarrel concludes with only a fragile truce. For Freud, your inner life operates in a similar manner. Liberty is not the triumph of one voice over the others, but an ongoing, uneasy clash between them. Freud's therapeutic practice of psychoanalysis aimed to uncover ongoing struggles rather than allow them to remain hidden. He clearly stated the goal: to make conscious what is unconscious, and to bring into the ego what has been repressed. To achieve this, he developed techniques such as free association, where patients speak without censorship, allowing hidden themes to emerge. Dream analysis was, in his words, the royal road to the unconscious, because dreams disguise forbidden wishes in symbolic form. By interpreting these symbols and tracing anxieties back to early experiences, the patient could gain insight into the origins of their distress. This understanding did not eliminate repression. It could not, but it offered greater conscious choice. In this context, freedom meant clarity rather than the absence of conflict. Nonetheless, Freud's perspective was sobering. Complete release from repression was unattainable. If the ID were to run unchecked, chaos would threaten society. If the superego were to disappear, No mechanism would restrain cruelty or injustice. Civilization depended on repression as its very foundation. Safety within communities was maintained only through collective restraint. Every individual was thus bound by an unseen agreement to accept compromise so that order could endure. Liberty would always be limited, conditional, and tinged with discontent. Sexual desire was particularly significant for him. Freud emphasized that childhood attachments decisively shape the unconscious. His controversial Oedipus complex theory proposed that young children develop an unconscious desire for one parent and rivalry towards the other. Whether accepted, criticized, or reinterpreted, this theory reinforced his larger claim. Sexuality and repression in childhood are not erased by aging. They continue to influence adult relationships and mental life, creating neuroses if left unresolved. From this perspective, liberty was never as simple as doing what you want. Even without rulers or laws to restrict you, unconscious forces still limit your actions. You might believe yourself free, he warned, but you can still act out hidden scripts shaped by past conflicts. Patterns of behavior, such as anxiety, self-sabotage, and repeated mistakes, often mirror unresolved repression rather than deliberate choices. In this way, freedom was always haunted and intertwined with forces beyond conscious control. Freud's views on religion reinforced this idea. He called religion a mass delusion. He believed humanity projected its childhood need for protection onto the heavens, creating a divine father figure as a shield against fears of nature and death. Religion provided comfort, but at the expense of truth. It offered safety through illusion, promising answers when life was uncertain. In this way, religion resembled civilization itself, repressing desires, shaping behavior, and containing anxiety, but through stories disconnected from reality. Security was achieved, but it was purchased at the cost of dependence. This connection between civilization, repression, and illusion shaped Freud's broader analysis of human unhappiness. He asserted that suffering arises from three sources: the weakness of our bodies, the power of nature, and the difficulties of social life. Civilization safeguards us against the first two through medicine and technology. However, addressing the third, human relationships, demands ongoing repression. We conform to norms and laws, suppressing aggression and selfishness so communities can endure. In doing so, we avoid danger, yet the very system that protects us also creates new misery. Safety and freedom never fully coincide. They are in constant tension. Freud believed that harmony was unattainable. He argued that dissatisfaction is inherent to the human condition. Repression cannot end without disrupting the social order, yet repression always leads to frustration. Civilization and its discontents is almost bleak in its honesty. Happiness exists, but never without a cost. At best, you negotiate with conflict. At worst, you suffer under its burden. By shaping the psyche's structure in line with society's demands, Freud built a mirror between the personal and the political. Just as states balance liberty and control, so too the mind balances the id and the superego. Compromise in one reflects compromise in the other. Each individual's struggle echoes the pattern of civilization: instinct restrained by rules, order achieved at the expense of satisfaction. Psychoanalysis sought to ease this struggle, not abolish it. By bringing repressed material to the surface, patients could lessen their inner conflict and gain clarity. However, the unconscious persisted. In Freud's view, it was a reservoir that could never be fully drained. That is why he described the aim of therapy not as curing discontent, but as making life more tolerable. Revealing hidden forces, so that choice became less obscured. Religion, repression, and civilization's pact all reveal one thing in Freud's work. Freedom is never purely external. It is involved in internal struggles where instincts and conscience battle for dominance. To understand liberty, one must see oneself as a contested landscape, divided between impulses one cannot eliminate and restrictions one cannot avoid. It is a pessimistic outlook, but it offers a vital insight. By claiming that civilization itself is a form of repression, Freud explained why discontent endures even in times of peace and abundance. He demonstrated why liberty constantly falls short of its promise, and why personal freedom can never be envisioned without considering the hidden pressures of memory and desire. In this way, the argument shifts. Freedom and order are not only controlled by governments or ensured by law, individuals also play a crucial role in maintaining them. They develop within the private conflicts of the mind, voices inherited from childhood, instincts pressing from below, compromises made again and again with no ultimate victory. Freud left us with this sober realization: every advance of civilization protects us from suffering while increasing the burden of repression. The inner struggle never ends, and freedom must constantly be redefined within its boundaries. This is where centuries of thought, from rulers, contracts, and constitutions to unconscious life, begin to converge. The ongoing conversation links societies with individuals, political agreements with personal compromises. Each thinker questioned what balance is needed between safety and liberty. Freud demonstrated that the question itself extends beyond the boundaries of society. His contribution was to shift the conflict inward, making liberty's greatest challenge the ongoing argument within the mind. That is where the dialogue leaves us, at the boundary between our external world and our inner one, where the very quest for freedom presses on both sides simultaneously. Now, when you step back and reflect on this long historical debate, you find a common thread running through them all: the ongoing struggle to live freely while still living together. From Hobbes's Leviathan to Freud's inner psyche, the same challenge persisted. Can humans ever live free while staying safe? Each thinker proposed a version of the bargain: give up something to gain stability, or hold on to liberty and risk disorder. It is worth pausing to notice how society, law, and even your own mind shape that balance every day. The rules you accept, the rights you defend, and the instincts you suppress all reflect this centuries-old debate.